Hi, this is Elliot from EO Nutrition, and in today's video we are going to be looking at how a long-term chronic deficiency or insufficiency of vitamin B1, otherwise known as thiamine, can produce symptoms which are separate from neurological based symptoms. So in the previous video, we looked at how neurological injury, nervous system dysfunction could be caused by a lack of thiamine, how this was associated with a condition called dry beriberi, how this primarily affected the brain and the central nervous system. However, in today's video, we're going to be looking at the flip side of that, how there is another form of beriberi, and this is called wet beriberi. Now, it was initially found out when they first discovered thiamine deficiency, they saw that a large portion of the people would present with neurological type symptoms, whereas there was another subset of the population who would get cardiovascular type symptoms. Sometimes these overlapped, sometimes there wasn't an overlap. So today we're going to be looking at the cardiovascular effects of a long-term thiamine deficiency. So if you recall me saying there's three main types of beriberi. One is dry beriberi, as I've just said, predominantly the nervous system. The second, which we're going to be looking at today, is wet beriberi, affecting the cardiovascular system. And third of all, there is gastrointestinal beriberi. So wet beriberi can produce many symptoms involved in the cardiovascular system, which can mimic other types of cardiovascular disease. For instance, we have peripheral vasodilation, or sometimes constriction, whereby the blood vessels are unable to effectively constrict or dilate at the right times. We also have tachycardia, so there is a rapid heart rate. We have edema, or sodium and fluid retention, sodium and water retention. So pitting edema can occur in the periphery, such as the lower limbs, and in other parts of the body. There can be high or low blood pressure, and depending on where it is, so you can have pulmonary hypotension or pulmonary hypertension. You can have orthostatic hypotension, which means low blood pressure when standing. This eventually leads to heart failure. So heart failure is a natural consequence of a thiamine deficiency affecting the cardiovascular system. There is naturally poor circulation, vascular changes, often vascular damage related to a thiamine deficiency. And in wet beriberi, there is often high cardiac output. So the heart is working harder than it ordinarily would need to be able to facilitate blood flow around the body. So the primary symptoms of an end-stage thiamine deficiency presenting as wet beriberi is high output cardiac failure, peripheral edema or fluid accumulation, fluid retention in certain parts of the body. There is peripheral cyanosis, so that means that the tissues in the periphery start to become a bluish color, reflecting a lack of oxygen and poor blood flow. And then there is also shortness of breath, which is reflected by an inability to effectively transport oxygen and ends up in an oxygen deficit. There is another type of beriberi which is kind of falls under the same category as cardiovascular beriberi, and this only manifests in some people, and this is quite severe. This is referred to as Shoshin beriberi. And in contrast to the high output heart failure that is seen in wet beriberi, this is characterized by low output heart failure. There is also peripheral edema. The vascular system completely collapses, so blood flow is essentially shut off from many areas. And there is systemic lactic acidosis, where excessive lactic acid production is occurring, and there is ultimately death within a short period of time if thiamine repletion is not undertaken. So as I said in the last video, there is a spectrum of severity. So when we're looking at thiamine deficiency, we must not assume that if someone does not have symptoms which could be diagnosed as beriberi, which is the full-blown end-stage deficiency, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are not on their way there. Someone can exist with a very mild or moderate insufficiency or deficiency level and still kind of function day to day. So they may not be able to be diagnosed and it may not be showing up in blood tests, but they can be functionally deficient in thiamine and present with many of the same symptoms as you would find in the end-stage deficiency. When you have a mild to moderate deficiency, you can develop certain symptoms without developing other symptoms. And this, I believe, is probably a lot more common than we are led to believe in our modern world. The potential symptoms that you might see in a mild to moderate deficiency include the normal types of symptoms. So fatigue, weakness, you may have paresthesias, chronic pain, neuropathy, brain fog, that kind of thing. We spoke about that last video. But specifically related to the cardiovascular system, you might see heart palpitations or tachycardia. There could be unexplained high blood pressure or low blood pressure. Atrial fibrillation is another one, or there might be something called a mitral valve prolapse, reflecting an underlying dysautonomia. There may be poor peripheral circulation. You could have peripheral edema. There could be blood pressure asymmetries, again, highlighting some kind of autonomic nervous system dysfunction. There can be lots of different things that can point towards a long-term thiamine deficiency. And interestingly, there have actually been many cardiovascular conditions in the clinical research which have been shown to benefit from thiamine supplementation. So here are some of the studies or some of the conditions which have been studied. There is congestive heart failure. So there is some good evidence showing that high-dose thiamine supplementation can improve the cardiovascular parameters in that condition. There is also pulmonary hypertension in distributive shock, when essentially the blood is pooling and the heart is unable to effectively transport blood around the body. Thiamine can be very beneficial in that case and could actually save someone's life. There is vascular dysfunction, so the vascular markers of oxidative stress and damage have been improved significantly with thiamine supplementation to prevent stroke or prevent the side effects of the stroke. The thiamine has been used, and also in arrhythmias. So when there is an irregular heartbeat, or what is known as cardiac arrhythmia, sometimes this responds very well to thiamine in a clinical care setting. So next up, let's look at some of the mechanisms of how thiamine deficiency affects the cardiovascular system and how you can develop cardiovascular pathology under conditions of low thiamine. If we just have a brief look back at some of the roles of thiamine, you can look at my previous videos where I talk about the biochemistry of thiamine and how this participates in normal human physiology. But essentially, thiamine is, one way to think of it is that it is crucial for energy metabolism. So it sits at several steps, or there are enzymes which use thiamine as a cofactor at several stages of energy metabolism, particularly related to the metabolism of glucose, but it's also important for the metabolism of amino acids and of fats. So it sits at the entry to mitochondrial oxidation as a cofactor for the enzyme pyruvate dehydrogenase. It's also involved in the pentose phosphate pathway to regenerate glutathione, which is the primary antioxidant, as a cofactor for an enzyme called transketolase. Essentially, what you need to know is that if you don't have enough thiamine, then you can develop severe energy deficits quite quickly. And this tends to be one of the mechanisms of injury in cardiovascular beriberi. So when we do not have enough thiamine, one of the byproducts of glucose breakdown called pyruvate is diverted toward lactic acid synthesis or lactate synthesis. Essentially, the consequences of a thiamine deficiency act much like the consequences of an oxygen deficiency. So we can develop a condition called pseudohypoxia, where the cells effectively act as though they are oxygen deprived, even though there is enough oxygen. And what we have is a depletion of ATP and starting to route our carbon toward lactic acid synthesis, which is going to place a burden on the liver through something called the Cori cycle, and essentially is going to render an energy deficit into the cells. Now Now, when we're looking at the mechanism of cardiovascular injury specifically, it's important to focus on how we are recycling ATP. So ATP is the primary source of energy for the cell. What ATP stands for is it is an adenosine. Adenosine is something called a purine nucleoside. And the adenosine is bound with 3 phosphate groups. And what we are doing when we are processing energy is we are removing the phosphate from the ATP and converting that into ADP. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate or adenosine 3-phosphates. And then when we are breaking ATP down to release energy, we are getting ADP. ADP is adenosine diphosphate, meaning adenosine and 2 phosphates. So what you need to understand is that when we are recycling ATP to continually remove energy from ATP, we are taking a phosphate group away from that and we are recycling it. So in energy transfer reactions, we are hydrolyzing or removing a phosphate group from ATP to make ADP with 2 phosphates. And then what we are doing is we are rephosphorylating that back to ATP when we need to. However, there is an alternate route that we can run ADP through. ADP can be dephosphorylated, so we can remove a phosphate group from ADP to make AMP. This is done by an enzyme called adenylate kinase. So AMP is adenosine with 1 phosphate group, adenosine monophosphate. Now, in ordinary conditions or in normal conditions, most of the ADP and AMP can be rephosphorylated. So that means that we add on extra phosphate groups to recycle or regenerate ATP to then process for energy. However, when there is a condition where we are running through energy stores excessively, when there is an energy deficit or when there is oxygen deprivation, what happens is without going too in depth into this process, we are using an enzyme called 5-nucleotidase to convert AMP into adenosine. So we remove that final phosphate group to produce the raw material, which is adenosine, and adenosine is released from the cells. And when you have free adenosine or excessive free adenosine is binding with certain receptors on vascular smooth muscles. So the smooth muscle, which is lining the blood vessels, free adenosine can bind with these receptors and actually cause vasodilation. So this is the action of adenosine on the receptors. It is stopping the vessel from constricting and causing excessive vasodilation. So this is proposed to be one of the primary mechanisms where thiamine deficiency, because of the energy deficit that it causes and the downstream effects on AMP being converted into adenosine and the release of adenosine, we are ending up with excessive peripheral vasodilation. And this is going to be very important further on down the line. So here's a diagram for those who don't know what vasodilation is. Essentially, when we are trying to regulate blood flow throughout the body, we are releasing certain neurohormonal components which act on the blood vessel walls to determine whether we need to constrict the blood vessels or to vasodilate them, to dilate them. And in the context of excessive adenosine, what we are getting is excessive vasodilation and potentially with an inability to constrict those blood vessels when it is appropriate. When we have excessive vasodilation, then this has several downstream effects. One of those is to reduce something called the systemic vascular resistance and ultimately to lower systemic blood pressure. Unfortunately, when this is pathological, then this may lead to significant drops in blood pressure, especially upon standing. So this could be one of the reasons why someone can develop a condition called postural hypotension. When they stand up, they start to get dizzy because their blood pressure is falling below the acceptable limit. Interestingly, it can also have the opposite effect on the blood pressure. So thiamine deficiency may activate one of the systems in the kidney and the related hormones. This is referred to as the renin-angiotensin system, otherwise known as the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So this involves several different hormones, including a hormone called renin-angiotensinogen, angiotensin-converting enzyme, and then aldosterone, antidiuretic hormone, affecting the kidneys and how we are processing fluids and electrolytes. So what this essentially, or what thiamine deficiency has been shown to do, at least in the animal research, is that when you have spontaneously hypertensive rats, by supplementing them with thiamine, what has been shown to do is downregulate the expression of certain enzymes involved in this pathway and to reduce hypertension or to reduce high blood pressure. So it seems that thiamine actually plays a key role in regulating blood pressure, although the mechanisms here have not been fleshed out very much in the research. Interestingly enough is that some of these mediators in this pathway can actually lead to oxidative stress in the vascular system, and using a lipid-soluble form of thiamine called benfotiamine can actually prevent the damage caused by some of those mediators. One of those is called angiotensin II. There are vascular changes that occur also. One of those is something called an arteriovenous shunt. There is changes in blood flow to different organs. One of those is the brain, so we have decreased cerebral blood flow. We also have, or we may develop, decreased renal blood flow, and when you have a lack of blood getting to the kidneys, then this can really hamper kidney function. Interestingly, there is a high cardiac output. So when we have decreased vascular resistance systemically, because we have this excessive dilation of the blood vessels, as I said before, primarily due to increased adenosine acting on the receptors, but then also there is the autonomic tone, the neurological aspect to this, which is likely going to affect how well we're able to constrict and dilate blood vessels in the first place. What this can culminate in is it forces the heart to increase output to compensate for those things. So the heart is having to work harder than it ordinarily would. Now there is sympathetic neural activation. So this activates the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system to cause a rise in cardiac output and several different hormonal adaptations around that. This ultimately culminates, because of the renin-angiotensin system, this can culminate in sodium retention and water retention. So we develop something called edema. Edema is essentially where we are holding on to excess water in tissues when we shouldn't necessarily be doing that. This can be seen when someone presses their finger against their shin bone or against a part of their leg or their ankle, and it leaves an indentation. This is edema, and this can actually be caused by thiamine deficiency. So I was talking about the renin-angiotensin system in the kidneys. Well, this has several important functions. One of those is to stimulate the retention of sodium, as I've said. It stimulates water retention, and you also have the activation of an antidiuretic hormone, which can stimulate thirst centers in the brain and produce something like excessive thirst. This might be why someone feels excessively thirsty when they have a thiamine deficiency, when there is this kind of imbalance going on. And so what happens is someone is consuming more water, yet they are retaining more and actually, or ultimately, excreting much less. So they end up with higher amounts of water in the body. This may also be one of the reasons why people have sodium intolerance. So I consult with many clients at the moment who can't tolerate sodium even in very small amounts because it causes them to puff up, or it causes the edema that they experience to get worse. I suspect that in some of these cases, because going through their past medical clinical history, I suspect some of this may be related to long-term chronic thiamine deficiency. There is overproduction of noradrenaline, which is one of the neurotransmitters, which again is stimulating the sympathetic nervous system. When there is excessive fluid retention, peripheral vasodilation, and When there is excessive fluid retention and peripheral vasodilation, you're having fluid retention in various different places in the body, and this increases the work for the heart to do. So coupled with a lack of ATP, because we have a thiamine deficit, and thiamine is essential for the production of ATP, the heart ultimately is needing to work harder and faster, but at the same time, it has less energy to do so. So this can cause heart failure. The heart cannot keep up with the requirement. We may develop systemic hypoxia. So essentially, the way that we are transporting oxygen around the body and utilizing that is going to be significantly disrupted. When we have this consistently high cardiac output, we have an energy deficit, the heart is unable to keep up. We get heart failure. This is one of the essentially what heart failure is, when the heart cannot effectively transport the blood at the rate that it's required. And so in some cases, you may develop something called cardiac hypertrophy, where the muscles of the heart actually hypertrophy, they grow larger. So this is how this can all present itself. And if you recall me saying, there is a spectrum of severity. So someone may not have cardiovascular beriberi per se, they may not be diagnosable in the medical sense, but they may have many of these symptoms. If you go back to some of these symptoms, we can now see how this might actually manifest itself in someone and the reasons why that might occur. In the literature, the neurological and cardiovascular presentation, or the manifestation of this, these two things can be manifesting at different times. Someone may manifest primarily neurological symptoms, other people may manifest primarily cardiovascular systems, whilst the symptoms can also coexist simultaneously. So someone may have some of the neurological or brain-based symptoms, and they may also have some of the cardiac symptoms. And honestly, I see this in clinical practice. A lot of the people who I work with these days actually seek me out because they think that they might have thiamine deficiency. And what I've found is that many of the people who respond very well to thiamine, these people often have a mixture of both the neurological and the cardiovascular symptoms. So they may have balance and gait issues, which is reflecting dysautonomia or autonomic nervous system dysfunction, but then they may also have a mild peripheral edema, something that the doctor may have prescribed diuretics for, or they may not have. They may have just had it kind of fobbed off. Ultimately, these people, it's often in the lower legs, in the ankles. They may have unexplained low blood pressure. This is very common, particularly in female clients that I work with. Resting tachycardia, so the heart rate might be slightly higher than it ordinarily would be. This could be demonstrative of chronic stress or autonomic dysfunction. It could also be a manifestation of these cardiovascular effects, which we've been looking at so far. There is postural hypotension or tachycardia. So I work with many people with postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which is a dysautonomia, but there's also unexplained low blood pressure upon standing and a higher heart rate. Again, you also have some very strange symptoms like unexplained chest pain, which is probably a reflective of an acute oxygen deficit hitting the heart. But there is also poor peripheral circulation, so chronically cold hands and feet, a history of cardiac abnormalities like atrial fibrillation, and the obvious symptoms related to fatigue, low energy, brain fog, and anxiety, etc. So for the listeners who are interested, I would highly recommend this essential book. It's called Thiamine Deficiency Disease, Dysautonomia, and High Calorie Malnutrition. It's by Dr. Derek Lonsdale and Dr. Chandler Mars. Dr. Chandler Mars runs a website called Hormones Matter, which is a wonderful repository for information on thiamine deficiency and how energy metabolism relates to many chronic health conditions which we see today in our modern world. So that's all for today then, folks. I hope that you can now see or appreciate how a thiamine deficiency can affect the cardiovascular system and how it can produce symptoms which are of a wide variety and which could be mistaken for some other kind of problem. So in the next video, I'm going to be examining how a thiamine deficiency might be implicated in type 1 and type 2 diabetes. We will look at how it is involved in blood glucose control, in insulin resistance, and why diabetics are likely going to have a much higher requirement for thiamine than other people. So if you like this video or you found it helpful, please like and subscribe to my page. You can find me on Facebook as EO Nutrition. My website is www.eonutrition.co.uk. I am taking on clients at the moment, so if you feel that I can help you with your issues, if you suspect that you have problems with thiamine or you'd like to investigate that, send me an email. You can find my details below this video. Other than that, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.